Right, we're doing Matthew's Gospel. So for our opening exercise, we thought that it might be good just in small groups of 4 or so to buzz about what you know, what stories about Jesus are found only in Matthew's Gospel, what parables of Jesus are told only in Matthew's Gospel. Can we do that for a few minutes? You'll find yourself being invited into a breakout room.
Okay then, who can tell me what stories are unique to the Gospel of Matthew?
The Magi.
Yes, that's one very obvious one, Norman, the Magi. It's not found anywhere else in the New Testament or any of the other Gospels.
The dreams, a lot of those dreams for angels and...
Yes, Matthew does have dreams. He's got a number of them in his Gospel, and they're unique to the Gospel of Matthew as well.
With the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew only talks about oaths, almsgiving, loving enemies, retaliation, which seem to me to be related to Jewish customs.
It is related to Jewish customs, though you will find a version of that in the Gospel of Luke as well. So Luke, the difference between Luke and Matthew's sermon is what? The big difference.
One's on the mountain and one's on the plain.
That's right. One's up a mountain and one's on the flat. So that's and Luke is much briefer than the long teaching narrative of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. What else? There's one other thing that's quite important that's unique in the Gospel of Matthew according to story. And I have to say, I'm going to be surprised if any of you find it or hit on it.
Judas?
Judas is. That's quite true, Bill. Judas dies by hanging in Matthew. How does he die in the Gospel of Luke? Well, it's not the Gospel of Luke. How does he die at the hand of the author of Luke Acts?
Is it suicide?
No, it's suicide in Matthew.
Oh, sorry.
He bled to death, but I'm not quite...
No, he doesn't bleed. Well, he does kind of. He actually, it swells up and explodes. Which people do, as you know. And that is in the book of Acts, of course.
But that was for the television series.
That's right. So, Bill, that's quite right. And that is something not as well known about the difference between Luke and Matthew. What is the other large difference in one of the most important stories in the Gospels?
Is it the fact that Matthew has the Lord's Prayer and Luke does not?
Luke does as well. Yep, it's just shorter.
Oh, okay.
Is it because of the resurrection when he's, he's only one who's had an earthquake and... Yes,
Henrietta is on track. It is around the Passion narrative. Who has heard the story of soldiers being put to guard the tomb?
Yes.
Do you know that? How many Gospels have that story?
Only one, obviously.
Only one, obviously, yes. It's the Gospel of Matthew. That whole interaction with putting soldiers to guard the tomb because that planos is the Greek, it means sorcerer. It's usually translated deceiver, because that deceiver said he would rise again and they didn't want his disciples stealing the body, is unique to the Gospel of Matthew, as is people who are dead walking around at the time of Jesus' death is also unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And then with the resurrection appearance, he's up a mountain again, and you have the Great Commission also unique to the Gospel of Matthew. So the ending, where it's kind of the same, does have some quite distinctive features. So what are unique about the parables? Are there unique parables in the Gospel of Matthew?
Yes, I kind of cheated and Googled it.
You're not supposed to do that. Gee whiz.
We were just confirming we were correct, but I actually found parallel versions of the parables of Jesus, and it even brings up the Gospel of Thomas. Some of those are in Thomas.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah. So what's unique to the Gospel of Matthew, having done all that hard Googling work?
Okay. The unmerciful servant was one of the parables that it's telling us was only in Matthew.
Yep.
Sorry, my eyesight's a bit bad. The lost sheep. The labourers in the vineyard.
Yep.
Another one. The two sons.
Yes.
Yep, Matthew 21. Yep. I think there were 4, I think, that we found.
There's more than 4.
Okay. The 10 virgins.
The sheep and the goats hasn't been listed yet.
The sheep and the goats, that's right.
That's right.
I'm going to say that a lot of those unique parables of Matthew could be put under one heading. What would that be? If I remind you of the wheat and the tares and the good and bad fish and the sheep and the goats, what do they all have in common?
Good and evil.
They do have good and evil, but what happens at the end?
The judgment day.
Judgment. That's
Judgment,
what they have
yeah.
in common.
Punishment, yeah.
Yes, judgment and punishment. So that is pretty unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And he includes a lot of special parables, particularly in chapter 13, that you won't find anywhere else. And judgment is something that concerns him mightily. So you can see Matthew's got his own flavour here. He's interested in things that the others aren't interested in. The Magi reflect his fulfillment of prophecy, where from the Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah 60, where it says kings will come and they will bring gifts of gold and frankincense. So we have fulfillment of prophecy. We have a lot of judgment that's unique to the Gospel of Matthew in his storytellings.
So we're going to look at...
Okay. No? Okay, John.
We're going to look at a video next, which gives a particular angle on Matthew's Gospel. This is not what's included in the video, not necessarily unique to Matthew, but the cumulative effect of these scenes is quite significant in Matthew's Gospel. So a mountain theme running through this Gospel. And what might the significance of a mountain be?
Moses.
Yeah, that's right. Moses and Mount what?
Sinai.
Sinai. That's right.
Also, didn't people in those days believe that gods lived in the mountains?
Some of them probably did, because the mountains are high and of course they're closer to the heavens. So it's logical that you might get closer to a god if you go up a mountain.
Well, I was basing that on that saying, you know, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my strength.
Mm.
Yeah.
But it's not going to come from the mountains. That's the point.
Do you want to unpack that, Bill? I know that's your voice, even though I can't find you. Oh, there you are.
Oh, here we are. Well, I thought the idea of that saying in the Psalms was that help doesn't come from the mountains, but it comes from the Lord.
Yes, because it does. It asks the question, I
Whence
lift my
cometh
eyes
mine-
from the mountains, from where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord.
It doesn't come with mountains.
Yeah, unless the Lord, of course, is in the mountains. But he's not usually in mountains other than Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus.
the thing about mountains is that I was just thinking about this yesterday. It's not at the top of a mountain. There's no river. There's nothing, probably not much growing. It's kind of desolate and above your everyday life. You have to go back to the valley to sort of survive. But a mountain's like a place of withdrawal where you don't have to deal with everyday problems. You're dealing with something that's bigger and more eternal.
Well, you're certainly dealing with something that's wilderness, and wilderness is a really important theme in the Bible. And I think part of what you say is correct. Mountains are desolate places, so they're wilderness. And that's where you go to encounter God.
Yeah.
But mountains are also places where you can see things. God took Moses up to a mountain before he died to show him what he was missing out on. And the devil took Jesus up into a mountain to show him the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he took him up a mountain to give him the 10 Commandments.
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So mountains have an important place in Jewish tradition.
Okay, so for the rest of the session today, we're going to be thinking a little bit about source criticism, and then we're going to be focusing on redaction criticism. Just a reminder of these, this slide with the sort of brief definitions that, or questions that relate to each of those. And you will find in your workbook on page 86 a chart that compares Matthew's Sermon on the Mount with Luke's Sermon on the Plain. So just in terms of thinking about the source that the sources that Matthew used to compile that sermon, you can see there with the 3 columns side by side, that's the first half of the chart. You can see on the screen how a number of the elements of the Sermon on the Mount are in Luke's Gospel. Now, the part that's in bold in the right-hand column is from chapter 6, which is Luke's Sermon on the Plain. But Luke obviously knew some of that other material, like salt of the earth, light of the world, because it appears elsewhere. In fact, those 2 sayings appear elsewhere also in Mark. So they're kind of triple tradition rather than the Q material. The same in the second slide, that the latter part of chapter 7 of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount has a fair number of parallels with Luke, although the wording's not exactly the same right throughout. But then the 2 roads and the 2 gates is a material that comes from elsewhere. So the combined effect of this, of that chart on that page, is to indicate how Matthew has woven together a number of sources or material from different sources to create what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. There's also
oral sources or written sources?
A mixture, because Mark we know is written.
Okay.
Q, we don't have any evidence of that. So one hypothesis is it was written. Another argument is that it was just a collection of oral sayings, because oral tradition was really strong in the 1st century.
Right.
The analogy with Q is often drawn to Thomas, because Thomas, which we do have a written text of, Thomas simply comprises 114 sayings of Jesus put together seemingly in no particular order, and each one just introduced with the simple phrase, Jesus said.
Okay.
So there's no narrative context like we have. Jesus was here, he went to this town, he went into this house, he was in the synagogue, he went up the mountain, all of that kind of stuff that we get in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not there in Thomas. But Thomas is a collection of sayings that provides a kind of analogy for perhaps Q could have been a source. For instance, just to give you some examples of what's in Thomas that's in the synoptics, here's a very simple one, a saying about a blind man leading a blind man, which we find in one version in Luke 6, in another version in Matthew 15, and that's the version that's in the Gospel of Thomas. Or the parable that's just been referred to, the good fish and the bad fish, only in Matthew's Gospel, but also in the Gospel of Thomas. You can see in the left-hand column there, slightly shorter version than in Matthew, but recognisably the same parable of Jesus. So
Matthew, of course, had a slight advantage over Luke in this thing, in that he didn't travel. He was stuck in Antioch or wherever it was. Luke had to pick it up in whenever he got back to Jerusalem.
Right.
So,
we actually don't know that, Derek. That's just some of the tradition stories that are told. There's nothing that actually indicates where Matthew was writing his gospel. And I would actively dispute the Antioch belief, because there's good reasons not to accept that as where Matthew was.
but it doesn't. Well, we don't hear of Matthew traveling. That's what I was sort of trying to get out.
We don't know the Gospel of Luke person travelled either. We have no idea.
The argument for that is the we passages in Acts where the author appears to be travelling with Luke, with Paul. So but we want to move on to redaction criticism, because we've got a series of things that we're going to do. Some of them are in your book, and we're going to start by thinking about the shape of Matthew's gospel. So this is Elizabeth's area, and she's going to rip you through a series of exercises.
Just to note a couple of things, Matthew has 5 discourses, and it's thought this is meant to echo the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah. Not so much in content, but there's 5 books that Moses is meant to have written or contributed to, and there's 5 books that Jesus teaches. So that's important. And they're the things that we have: the sermon, missionary instructions, a whole collection of parables, community instructions, again, unique to the Gospel of Matthew. And then we've got this whole thing on eschatology, that is the end times and what's going to happen. And it concludes with the passion and resurrection narrative, as does all of the Gospels, including the Gospel of John. So the 5 books of the law, this is how we see a Moses typology, because it's thought Matthew was modelling his Jesus on Moses. So there's 5 books of the law given by Jesus in his discourses. And then Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount as Moses gives the law from Mount Sinai. We have the infant Moses is the only one of his generation to survive a pogrom of male infants who are young. The infant Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, that's another story unique to Matthew that we didn't pick up on earlier, that Herod orders all the children under the age of 2 or 3 to be killed. So Jesus survives this kind of pogrom and is the only survivor of his generation. We have the infant Moses in Egypt, and we have the infant Jesus also in Egypt when they flee to escape the pogrom. And then when Moses returns to Israel, Jesus comes back to Israel with his family. Moses parts the water of the Red Sea, and Jesus goes one better and actually walks on water. So there's a number of things about Matthew's gospel that is meant to tie you to thinking about Moses. And I suppose Jesus is being presented in some ways as the new Moses. Matthew's community is a law-abiding community, and we know that from a number of things that happen. There's the first little dialogue and he has with Pharisees and Sadducees, and they ask which is the greatest commandment. And he answers from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. You shall love God with all your heart and mind, soul. And on these 2 commandments hang the law and the prophets. We also find that in Mark and Luke. So that's not exceptional. But some of the next things are, only in Matthew's gospel does Jesus say, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish but fulfill. And until heaven and earth pass away, not a letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law. And then in chapter 23 is the knockdown argument, where he actually says, he talks about the law, and we haven't got the passage there. I actually wanted, John, which is 2 to 4. In 2 to 4 in chapter 23, he actually says, obey every single thing the Pharisees teach you, because they sit on the seat of Moses and they teach the law of Moses. So that is the knockdown argument, that this is a community under law. And then he goes on to say, however, don't do as they do, because they don't actually follow what they teach. And this is 23:23 and is an example of this, saying, you know, you might teach the law, but look at you, you're horrible. And Matthew doesn't particularly like Pharisees, as you can see from this, he's in dispute with them. But the other thing we find in Matthew is the emphasis on a Greek word, anomia. Anomia is actually one of those things that's got a word with a prefix. Nomia is law. You put an A in front of it, it's literally not law. So it's lawlessness or being without law. So Matthew talks about not having the law. Often in your Bibles, this might be translated as wicked or evil. As you can see here, in verses 23, I never knew, go away from me, you evildoers. That's not literally what it says. It's go away from me, you without law. And the same down in verse 41, the causes of sin and all evildoers. It isn't all evildoers, it's lawless people. Now, we think of lawless as anarchy, but that's not what the Gospel of Matthew is talking about. He's meaning they don't follow the law. So that's an important distinction in this gospel. And unless you're looking at the Greek, you don't pick up how much he actually uses it and probably what he is meaning by this. Is there any questions on that at this point?
Yeah, I was reading a bit, Elizabeth, where the point was made that Matthew restricted his mission of Jesus only to the Jews. So he sort of, they didn't go to the Samaritans or to other communities. And it wasn't until like the final commissioning where he says the mission of Jesus is something beyond the Jews, to the wider community.
That's correct. John, can you pick that up, because the bed people need me.
Oh, okay. Yes, there is. I think we've got that in a passage. In the, no, maybe we don't. We've got that somewhere. Yeah. Yes. In chapter 10, and then indeed in chapter 15, which we're going to be looking at next. Jesus makes it very clear that he is sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In chapter 10, when he sends the disciples out on mission, he says, don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans, which of course is quite striking, because we have stories in other Gospels about Jesus engaging certainly with Samaritans and probably also with Gentiles.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. He never engages with Samaritans in the Gospel of Matthew. Mm. Hmm.
In terms of that last one there from the parable of the weeds and the wheat, chapter 13, verse 42 says that the punishment for those that do not have the law is that they will be thrown into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping of gnashing of teeth. It's a mix of metaphors here, because the weeds are collected up and thrown into the furnace to be burnt. That makes sense at a literal level, but that then becomes an analogy for what happens to evildoers, that is, people without the law, where they're thrown into this furnace and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And this next slide has some of the other places where that same thing occurs. It's in chapter 8 and also in these places. This is why I like to call Matthew the Gospel of the dentist.
There's a lot of gnashing of teeth.
Yeah, and therefore you have to go and see the dentist. Well, I
But
presume...
there's weeping as well. I suppose one weeps when you go to the dentist, where you can.
You used to.
That's right.
I think one of the things that does come through is this rather nice linguistic style or markers that he uses, like these, you know, the gnashing of weeping and gnashing of teeth, or those endings to those 5 sections where he says, and when he had finished saying these things.
Yeah.
So these are quite deliberate markers.
Yeah.
And I just find it fascinating that in these times when they must have had very limited tools for writing, that they're using these quite sophisticated writing elements.
Yes.
I actually think, Bill, that we grossly underestimate in our own minds as modern people the skill in writing of the ancient authors.
Yeah.
Even the Hebrew writers, with their command of all the literary devices they use, like parallelisms and chiastic structures and all sorts of metaphors and similes and hyperbole, they're not primitive in the sense that they don't think in a primitive way. I mean, they're limited by their scientific knowledge and lack of in post-industrial things that we have, but they are the masters of their language, those who are literate and who write in this way. And you're quite right, Matthew is very beautifully constructed.
Is weeping and gnashing of teeth something from the Old Testament? I don't remember it.
No, not really. He could have well got it from the what's called the intertestamental stuff, where there's a lot of heaven and hell in that, because there's no hell in the Old Testament. So Matthew can't have got it from the Old Testament. He's probably got it from the apocalyptic literature of the intertestamental period, books like Enoch that describe heaven and hell. And he's probably influenced, and all Jewish writers were probably influenced by the fact that Hellenistic belief included, you know, a Hades, but everyone went to Hades. There's no heaven and hell. But how you are treated in Hades depended on how you lived your life, whether you got some eternal punishment or some eternal reward. And Luke reflects that with his parable of the rich man and the poor man. You see that Hellenistic idea of Hades being played out. So Matthew, I think, is probably getting it from places like Enoch, which is a book of the intertestamental period. And he's certainly into hell in a big way. If you read progressive literature, they'll probably want to tell you that what Matthew really means is a rubbish dump called Gehenna on the outskirts of Jerusalem. No, he doesn't, because that's not what he says. He talks about outer darkness and eternal lakes of fire and things like that. So when you read these passages, he is definitely putting them into a place of eternal torment. Doesn't mean I agree with Matthew, but that's what he's doing. Okay.
Yeah. So
source and redaction criticism. Once you realise you've got a source that you're working with, you can actually then do some assessment of the editing. So it's looking through each account. So in Matthew's case, we're reading Mark, and we're looking at the similarities across all three Gospels and thinking of what they are. And then we're going to think of the differences. How has Matthew changed the Gospel of Mark? How might he be different if it's a Q saying to the Gospel of Luke? So, and think about, are they, well, not so much a four-source hypothesis, but are they showing evidence or support for the fact that Luke and Matthew know something Mark doesn't, and Luke and Matthew are both using Mark? And what are the differences tell us about the interests of the author? That's probably the biggest thing with redaction criticism, because when you have something that an author is using and you can see how they've altered it, it tells you a lot about their thinking. Is this in their book, John?
No, this one isn't.
Okay.
And I think you've talked about this before somewhere.
Yeah.
Have you?
Yes, this is the stilling of the storm, and we're going to look at that in our big group briefly before we look at more detailed stuff in Matthew. I've talked to you before about a special word that Matthew uses that is never translated properly, and which John has translated properly here and put the Greek in. So you can see that Matthew uses the word seismos in 24, where Mark and Luke in this very same story are using lilacs, which is a windstorm, and that's how it's generally translated. And Matthew's seismos, which is not a windstorm, is also translated that way. So we've looked at that before, but what I want you to do is have a look at the order of events in these stories and see if is this the same order at the moment, just ignoring the fact Matthew's used a different word. Well, there's one thing I'm going to notice. Look at verse 23 in Matthew and tell me, is that different?
No.
Yes, it is. There's a word there that's really important in the Gospel of Matthew.
The disciples followed.
The disciples follow him. That's right. You'll see in Luke and Mark, that word is missing. So the disciples follow him into the boat. Okay, next slide, please, John. So let's look at the order here. So what does Matthew add in verse 25, firstly?
Lord,
save us.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
He adds a little creedal saying, Lord save us, which we could put in almost any sort of hymn or prayer. And that is missing from the others. And then what happens with the order?
In Matthew, he asks them first why they're afraid, and then he stills the storm. But in Mark, it's the opposite way around.
Yeah, and in Luke, it's also the opposite way around. So Matthew's changed the order. He's asked the question before the storm is stilled. So why do you think Matthew might do that? And you'll need to think back to the fact Matthew's using the word seismos here. And I don't think he's suggesting it's a literal earthquake. So what is Matthew doing?
Making a point about fear.
He is making a point about fear and faith.
Yeah.
What if the boat represented his community and the seismos represented the torments that were meant to come on such a community because they're sticking to what Jesus says, getting towards the end of time, because Matthew firmly believes it's within striking distance, this end of time. So what if that was the case? So it's working as a metaphor here, and it's quite a sophisticated metaphor. So if it's to the community in the storms of persecution, does it make sense to ask them, have they got faith amidst the storm, or ask them after the storm is calmed?
Amidst the storm.
Amidst the storm.
Yes.
Yeah. So Matthew is doing a good Jewish midrashic technique here. He's adapting the saying that he has inherited and the order he has inherited for his community.
Okay.
So he's changed the order to reflect that. Why are you afraid? It's about keeping faith under the storm while it's happening, not after it's been calmed.
That's highly nuanced, isn't it? Like,
yes.
In his community, people would have been alert to this, I guess, because otherwise he wouldn't have written it this way.
That's right. It is highly nuanced. And getting back to that literary skill I was talking about with Matthew, it's quite highly developed. And the fact he's chosen that word seismos, and Luke and Mark clearly show the source is lilaps, which is a windstorm. It tells you straight away he's doing something different with this parable. It's not meant to be read just as a nature miracle. It's going to operate as this metaphor. And we know they're a community under persecution for a variety of things. The Beatitudes, the beginning of the chapter 10, the mission, where he says you'll be flogged and beaten and dragged before people in my name. So we can assume from that there's things happening. And it's about standing firm in faith whilst the storm rages around you, not while it's still. So I think that's the point Matthew's making.
And it's sort of interesting too that, like, we recognise it because we see the difference between the Gospels.
Yeah.
Whereas the people of that time wouldn't have had that. They wouldn't have had that, would they? They'd have one Gospel gone to their community.
Probably by the 3rd and 4th centuries, they would have at least pieces of other Gospels.
I was thinking more in the times of when it was being written and read.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't have. They would have had, and it was done in good Jewish style. You write it for your contemporary circumstances and you shape the story that speaks into those circumstances, which is what the Jewish people did. And all the gospel writers, I think, pick that up. So, yeah. Okay.
You should do some study on Matthew, Elizabeth.
Yeah, very funny, Bill. Hilarious.
We've got the places in Matthew where seismos appears.
Yeah, I've told you he uses it in a number of places. We've just seen one. So we have an earthquake arising on the sea, and that tells you something special is going on. So where does Matthew use seismos? Matthew uses it where there's an inbreaking of the divine into the mundane or into earth. So you find it in chapter 24, where you've got the whole end of the world being described in the last judgment. And it's a very apocalyptic chapter. And it tells you a sign of that is famines and earthquakes in various places, because that's the beginning of the new heaven and earth. And the next place we find it is in chapter 27, where the earth shakes and the rocks are split at the moment. The temple veil is torn in two, and we've got all sorts of wondrous happenings here. The tombs are open, bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. This is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. So we have, and then of course we have a centurion at the guard, again unique to the Gospel of Matthew, who are looking after the tomb, but a great earthquake takes place. It's the same earthquake. This isn't the tomb, sorry, the cross, where the earth's shaking and the rocks are breaking. And the centurion recognizes it as an apocalyptic thing. That is, God has broken into the world and is making a point about his displeasure, probably. And then the last point we find it is there's a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord has descended from heaven and rolled back the stone and sat on it. So you can see every time that God has something to say to the world, Matthew is using this term seismos. So we can assume when he uses it in the stilling of the storm, he's making the same point. It's about the inbreaking of God into the world, and that alerts us straight away not to read it as a straight nature miracle, but there's something going on that's different, and there's a deeper level of meaning to that story. Any questions about that?
I was going to say, for people who take the Bible literally, they must go bananas when they see the differences between, you know, different, the sources are different, like the source words.
They do, you know, that's why translation is so important and pointing these things out. And I have had first year people at UTC, where I taught for about 14 years, literally go bananas when I point this stuff out. And it's hard to reconcile, but it's easy to reconcile if you accept each gospel writer shaped their material for their circumstances and their community. And if you understand that, you understand why there's differences and different emphases. So in source and using redaction criticism, which is looking at editing of sources, we're going to read through the accounts, notice the similarities, notice the differences, think about what the sources are, and think about what it's telling us about the interests of the author. And we're going to look at some passages now from the Gospel of Matthew.
Can you just go back to that screen?
Yeah,
that
sure.
one?
You go back one, John. Okay.
Sorry.
So read.
Thank you.
Similarities, differences, source, interests of authors. So there's 5 things you're looking for. Okay, the first one we're going to look at, is this in their books?
Yes, page 88. Page 88 of the books.
In page 88 of your book, you've got Matthew and Mark's account of a woman. She is not the same woman necessarily in both passages. I'm going to put you into groups now for 15 minutes, John. What time is it?
Yes, that'll be all right.
Yeah, for 15 minutes, because we'll spend a lot of time on this one. And I want you to look at all of those things. What has Matthew done with Mark? And why do you think he's done it? Well, welcome back. What did you find?
Lots.
Lots.
Yeah.
Well, the first question I'm going to ask you is this the same story?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it
Same
is.
story. Yes.
Does it have exactly the same details?
No.
No, it doesn't. So let's start. And you can tell me what's different about this story between Matthew and Mark.
Well, one of the things that we noted was that in the story with Mark, the only interaction we hear about is between Jesus and the woman. So it's this constant interaction with the woman and Jesus. But in Matthew, the disciples are thrown into the mix, and
Yes.
the disciples start to add to the dialogue. So there's this 3-way thing happening.
Yes, so the disciples are there, and you'll find Matthew has a lot more direct speech.
Yeah.
Rather than just narrating it. Okay, what else is different?
In Matthew, he's called Lord, but in Mark, it's Sir.
Yes. She seems to acknowledge him some way, doesn't she?
Yes, yes, but
And
not
Matthew,
as the Lord.
no. And Matthew keeps drawing back to that he seems to know who he is, Lord, Son of David. So he keeps bringing back into the Old Testament. He's trying to emphasize that Jesus is divine, his divinity. He seems to be sort of emphasizing that.
And who's that on the mouth of? Who's saying that?
The woman.
The woman is.
The
Canaanite woman. Now someone said Canaanite. Is that what Mark uses?
No.
Gentile.
Mark uses, yes, a Gentile woman of Syrophoenician origin. What has Matthew got?
Canaanite woman.
Canaanite woman. Is there a difference?
Well,
Canaanite,
there is.
Yeah.
Canaanite covers a whole multitude of sins. Anyone who lived in Canaan who wasn't a Jew was a Canaanite. Now,
What is the significance?
Mark's more specific. He's calling her. He's still saying she's a Gentile, not a Jew, but she lives in Syrophoenicia.
Yes, he makes that point. But I'm going to suggest to you, Derek, Canaanite is specific for a reason. What would that reason be?
To underline that she's undesirable, that she's like...
Wasn't Canaan the area that the 12 tribes settled when they moved into the Promised Land?
Exactly. So the Canaanites...
A Canaanite is more likely to call Jesus Lord, Son of David.
Of course she is, because they are the conquered. That Israel is the conquerors and the Canaanites were the conquered, even though, as Derek points out, they're like Israel, they were a disparate group of tribes. They went by the name of their land, as Israelites go by the name of their land. And we have, John's just put a map up there for you. You can see where Canaan is in the days of Judges. And so Matthew has changed the name, and I am suggesting to you that's not random. He has picked the conquered race, and yes, she would much more likely to know the Jewish terms such as Son of David than a Gentile woman would. So that's a significant point.
Elizabeth, is it a fair jump of logic to say in Mark, where he talks about a Gentile, Syrophoenician origin, he's saying, and look, ladies and gentlemen, Jesus dealt with people who weren't Jews?
Yes, I think Mark is saying that, and I think Matthew is not saying that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because Canaanites kind of occupy this strange liminal space between Jew and Gentile, because they're not either. And they were servants and other things of the Israelite nation, well, in the way Israel tells the history they were. And we're going to discover a bit more about that as we get into this story. So someone's already noted the disciples have been brought into this story, and they're saying, send her away. She keeps shouting only after us. And we need that for a reason, because what then does Jesus say?
I was sent only to the
lost sheep of Israel.
Yeah.
It's a Jewish thing. He's really talking to the Jewish community.
He certainly is. Jesus puts his foot down and says, I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So it's a very exclusive statement that Jesus is making here, where Mark is making a more inclusive suggestion at this point. And you can see this prohibition is repeated in chapter 10 at the beginning of the mission discourse, where Jesus starts with the instructions, go nowhere among the Gentiles, enter no town of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So Matthew says this twice. So part of when we're doing exegesis, as you remember from last week, is we look at where else these things might occur in the gospel and indeed in other gospels. And we discover that this saying of Jesus is found once more in Matthew and only in Matthew.
The question we asked ourselves was, what, is this part of the learning curve that Jesus was faced with during his ministry?
That's quite possible. So let's move to back. Let's have a look at Mark's gospel. What does Jesus say to the woman?
Let the children be fed first.
Okay, let the children be fed first. Who are the children?
Children of
Israel. So the suggestion is let Israel be fed first. So that leaves the door open, does it not, for Gentiles to be fed secondly?
Next, yeah.
Yes. So we've got this statement here, but what happens in Matthew? Is that statement in Matthew?
No.
No, it's not.
No.
He's giving this woman a chance to show her faith.
Well, he is in Matthew, and we'll come to that, Derek, because you're quite right. So it is not let the children be fed first. Matthew leaves that out, but then he puts the next bit in. For it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. And you can see that is an identical statement. He's just dropped that first clause.
We noticed,
go on.
Oh, we noticed also initially Jesus doesn't answer her at all.
No, he ignores it.
In Matthew. Yeah, and then it's only when the disciples butt in.
Yes.
Drawn into that conversation.
And the woman repeats the Lord help me. So she's got have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. And then in verse 25 in Matthew, she says, Lord help me. So it says that the woman bows down she bows down in the Gospel of Mark.
Yes.
She bows at his feet. So this woman kneels at his feet. So it's the act of a supplicant, of someone kneeling before the altar of God or kneeling before somebody of greatness, which she's doing. Again, she addresses him as Lord, Lord, help me. And they're like little creedal statements, aren't we? We heard Lord save me in Matthew in the stilling of the storm. And here we've got have mercy on me, Lord, and then Lord help me. So these little creedal sayings pop up throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Let's go back to Mark.
One of the big differences is the shouting in Matthew and the begging in Mark.
Yes, so she begs him, and she's begging him in Matthew, but she's very persistent, and begging him in Mark, but she's so persistent in Matthew because she's been told to go away. She's been told Jesus isn't interested in her race because he's only come into the lost sheep of Israel, and she is persisting. This is one very feisty woman we have here in the Gospel of Matthew.
Is Matthew being sexist and racist?
He is.
He's a first century Jew, of course he is.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, women back then had no real place, really, did they? Like, it would have been a very big thing for a woman to go and talk to a rabbi back then, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Especially the Canaanite.
Yes, this is an unaccompanied woman following a bunch of blokes around. She's on very slippery ground as far as social mores are concerned. Very slippery ground. She's not, I mean, she's probably being seen as something that smells rather nasty by the disciples in the story of Matthew.
And the disciples just are showing what they're made of, because they've done this 2 or 3 times before and will do it 2 or 3 times later. Don't let the children, shoo the children away. Don't take them onto your knee. All this sort of thing. The disciples are on way back down the learning curve. Jesus is at least ahead of them.
Well, not by much.
No.
Not Matthew, not by much he's not.
But he's being fed Roman soldiers and all sorts of people to get him to look up a bit further than where he was.
You'll find in the Gospel of Matthew that he's only interacting with Gentiles twice. It's here and the Roman centurion.
Yeah.
And they have to demonstrate.
And in both cases, it was an eye-opener for him.
Yes, in both cases, it is a learning curve. But to say Matthew is fond of Gentiles would be a total overstatement. He's not, and he insults them frequently. But that's another story. Let's get back to Mark. So after the common phrase, it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs, what happens in Mark?
She answers him.
She comes back and argues with Sir.
She comes back and argues, yes, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Well, let's look at Matthew's version of this because it's different. What has Matthew added?
Masters.
Masters. Remember what I said about Canaanite people and Israelites?
Yeah.
Yeah. He's emphasising it here, the master's table.
Yeah.
So even the dogs that eat crumbs that fall from the master's table, but not even the dogs under the table eat children's crumbs. So in Mark's story, the woman's picking up, let the children be fed first. In Matthew's story, she's picking up the fact that Jesus has said he only goes to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and says even dogs eat crumbs from the master's table. It's different. That word profoundly changes it. Okay, back to Mark. What happens then in verse 29?
They're able to go.
Yeah, but for what reason? Why does Jesus heal the woman's daughter?
The demon
The
is
demons left her.
I know the
Because of
demons
what
left
she
her.
said.
Answer.
Why?
For saying that.
because of what she
Yes.
said.
Jesus says, for your smarty pants clever asked saying, you win. That's what is happening in Mark. And the demon has left your daughter, and she goes home and finds the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Matthew is not happy with this. What does Matthew do with this?
He has to justify why Jesus did it. Just your
Yes.
faith is great. Yeah.
Woman, great is your faith. There's no faith necessary in Mark. She's just bested him in the argument.
Yeah.
But in Matthew, it's woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. And the daughter was healed instantly. So that's a little different too. And the point is made that the child is healed instantly.
Yeah.
And it's the woman's faith. So what does this tell us about the writer of the Gospel of Matthew?
He's xenophobic and
He's xenophobic,
sexist.
racist and sexist. Yes, he's probably all of those things.
He spun things a bit for his audience. Like
Yes.
I'm not even sure whether it was for his audience or for himself.
Like
Probably a bit of both.
He wants people to follow Jesus, but he wants a certain people, and he's putting it in a way that will make it the most attractive to pick up those people.
Yes. I mean, this is a sect under law that sees themselves still part of Judaism. So Matthew has spun, if you like, the story of the Canaanite woman to reflect that particular bias that he's got in writing.
Are you suggesting then that some of these things he just sort of made up? Like, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Or would that have been in Q? Or
it's not in Q because it's not in Luke. It's unique to Matthew.
Well, this is a really interesting historical question, Susan, because
it's very naughty if he made it up.
Well, is Matthew making it up, or is Matthew reporting what he understands the practice of Jesus was? Jesus, being a good Jew, devoted to the law, recognised the problems of life encountering Gentiles, the impurity that caused, the need to restore yourself from that, and therefore Matthew's view of Jesus may well have been as someone who held to the law and therefore did not want to engage with Gentiles. So whether that's Matthew reading Jesus correctly, or whether that's what Jesus was and it's been softened by Mark or Luke, or whether Matthew just makes it up out of nowhere, they're your options. And I think there's no way of proving one or the other, but I think could be fairly persuasive that that's historically what Jesus was like.
It could well be that Matthew is one of the disciples who's saying, send her away, she keeps shouting at us. I mean, he was surely there if he was in the party.
Okay. Oh, of course he's there, because he's talking to the disciples.
Yes, I know. Matthew was a disciple.
Can I ask a question that's perhaps...
No, Matthew wasn't a disciple.
What was that question, sorry, Piers?
I said Matthew wasn't a disciple.
Well, we don't know. He probably
different
wasn't.
Period of, it's a generation, 2 generations away from Jesus.
We don't actually know who wrote the gospel. That's the whole point. And Matthew's probably writing somewhere between the years 60 and 70. So So if he was a disciple, he'd be a very old man.
In the email that I'll send you following on from this session, I'll give you a link to some things that I've done in my blog about authorship of the Gospels, what is said in the Gospels and what is said about the Gospels. And the conversation between Piers and Derek really reflects a conversation between what is said in the Gospel and what is said about the Gospel subsequently. But I'll leave that. I'll just entice you with that and say I'll send you out those links.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, can I ask a quick question? So
Yeah, sure.
Our group. In Mark, up at the beginning, we're told that Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there.
Yeah.
So, and if Matthew is pretty much following Mark, why did he leave that out?
Good question. Fair and to the point. Jesus pretty much doesn't enter Gentile territory in the Gospel of Matthew. The idea of him going into a Gentile house in the region of Tyre would be anathema to Matthew. So he just removes it.
He just decides, I don't like that. I'm just going to.
That's exactly right. He's just edited that out because that does not suit his purpose at all.
Right.
And if you look at Matthew, she comes out from the region. In verse 22, Jesus is going towards the district of Tyre and Sidon, and then a Canaanite woman comes out from the region. It's doubtful if Jesus even puts his pinkies over the border.
Okay, yeah.
I thought there was quite a large Jewish population in Tyre anyway. So
after this,
to a Jewish hub.
That's quite possible, but the Jewish Jesus of Matthew does not go into Gentile territory.
Yes, I accept that. I accept that.
That's quite likely. There were Jewish communities everywhere.
Thank you.
But Matthew is particularly fussy about where his Jesus goes. The idea of him going into a Gentile house, no, that comes out, and he just changes that.
According to the map in my Bible, Tyre was part of David and Solomon's kingdom. So was it not in Canaan? The original Canaan, was it outside Canaan?
It was outside, because who can tell me who were the original people of that area?
Yes.
Phoenicians?
Close. It's before that, though. Starts with the same two letters.
Philistines.
Philistines.
Oh, Philistines.
Yeah. So at some point they were conquered by Israel, but they weren't part, I don't believe, of the original division of land, and Israel was frequently at war with them.
Right.
Okay. Is anyone surprised by the differences here? Did you realise they even were here?
No, that's what we were saying. You know, until you've pointed all this out, now I'm quite paranoid about Matt. It's like you read all this other stuff into it now.
This is what redaction criticism is about. And you can see in the next exercise, which we won't have time to do, but if you look at it in your books on page 89, you will find there's a great chunk of material in the middle of Matthew, verses 17 to 20, that is not in Mark and Luke. And that's the whole thing about, you are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, you will bind on earth and loose on earth as you do in heaven. That might remind you of something. It should, because Matthew mentions it in another place. And that's a great big thing unique to the Gospel of Matthew, because again, this is his interest. And beware of the word church. That's a poor translation of ecclesia. We're used to thinking of ecclesial things as things of the church, and it's certainly the word has become attached to church. But in Matthew's time, that's not what it meant. In Matthew's time, it meant assembly, community, gathering. It is much more accurate to say, I will build my community. That is the true Jews, not those other rabble out there following the Pharisees. I will build my community on a rock. Church is a bit anachronistic in this, and we shouldn't really be using it, but again, translators bias, they cannot help themselves. But Matthew is probably using the word from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and in the Septuagint it means congregation, assembly, community, gathering, mostly of the people of God. He just wants a different word to synagogues because he's been kicked out of them, so he's establishing his own gatherings. But you can look at that for yourselves and see what you think about that. But that's the main thing to note about Matthew 16 and Mark 8. that we've got these other very Jewish things added in, because binding and loosing and the keys of the kingdom are terms used by the rabbis about the law and how it's followed and how it's doing the will of God. So John might like to send you a link to that kind about keys and binding and loosing.
Yes, I did a blog on that when it came up in the lectionary, so I'll send you the link to that too, and you can read the collated information.
You've been promoted, John.
I've been what?
You've been promoted to someone of some messianic status.
I have a view. I have an opinion. It doesn't mean it's necessarily right. Not in this household.
It's because I accidentally started saying Jesus, and no, he's not Jesus.
I see.
Just a quick little point, which is probably immaterial, but normally when you, like Mark is the shorter gospel and his stories are more punctuated and punchy. So when you take a shorter story, you would add things to it, is understandable. But to take things out of a shorter story, as Matthew has done here, like in the beginning bit about, is I think interesting, and the fact that he's not interested in Mark's secrecy.
No.
Mark has a few issues, like a few areas where he says, you know, don't tell anybody about this. This is only for you, that sort of thing. And that's one of the specific things that Matthew has removed.
Matthew also removes Mark's flowery descriptions. The description of Jesus asleep on the cushion in the boat with the stilling of the storm comes out. You'll find all the stuff in the Gadarene or Gerasene demoniacs, because Matthew changes the name. You'll find all the lively descriptions of the bloke in the tombs and what he's doing, and is all removed by Matthew.
Okay, good.
So he does take out some stuff like
interesting
that.
point that I noticed once before, that Mark's if Mark and Luke and Matthew all tell the same story, there's a lot more detail in Mark.
There is, Derek, and I'm glad to hear you've noticed that, because I always argue about this short, punchy Mark and stuff. Matthew's far more directive. Mark has this whole flowery explanation in the Gadarene demoniacs. Jesus stands in the boat and says, go, in Matthew. That's it. All of that detail is just gone.
Okay.
And the story of in Mark in the Gadarene demoniac, the healed demoniac goes through and proclaims his healing all through the Decapolis, and that's Mark. Matthew takes that out as well. We can't have any proclaiming among Gentiles. That won't do it all. So out that comes
No, we're not doing that.
No, we're not in Matthew.
Well, the theory that Mark is relating Peter's memories probably explains why there's more detail. Possibly explains.
It's possible, but I just think Mark likes that kind of detail myself, Jerry.
Mark's more focused on the narrative of Jesus, and setting and narrative go hand in hand and are very strong, whereas Matthew seems more focused on the teaching.
Yes, I think that's
so setting isn't as important.
Setting is important, but it serves teaching rather than vice versa.
Yes.
Yeah, teaching is very important. And if you read chapter 10 right till the end, you'll find Jesus has some very strong things to say about teaching and teachers and who are teachers and what you call them and what you don't call them. And he uses some highly unusual words in chapter 10 about, you won't pick it up through translation, but you could Google it and you will find that. And you'll find in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is never addressed as rabbi except by whom?
Judas.
Who?
Judas.
It is Judas, and you've been to my Bible studies. So that's why she knows. But yes, Judas is the only person in the Gospel of Matthew that calls Jesus rabbi. So I leave you to draw your own conclusions about what Matthew thinks of that word.
Well, Paul warns about teaching too, doesn't he?
Yes. So it's all about this false teaching and who's the teacher. And he tells the disciples, you are not to be teachers.
That's right.
Because I'm your teacher. Even if I'm not here, I'm still your teacher. So he's got some interesting things at the end of chapter 10 and the mission discourse on that.
I've got a friend who refuses to call a Catholic priest father because you only have one father.
That's right. It's the same logic as in the Gospel of Matthew. Exactly. Well, we've come to the end of our time. So unless someone else has a burning question, we should wind up. Is there anything for next week, John, that people need to know?
Well, I'll send this email and you can do a bit more reading about Matthew, but the first 3 pages in the Luke Acts section, that's pages 91 to 93. It's probably worth having a look at that. And we're going to be doing more redaction criticism exercises next week, looking at Luke and Mark.
Yeah.
So pages 91 to 93. And
Quell's surprise, you'll find there's a bit of a difference in Luke's attitude and Matthew's attitude. So you might find it a bit more compatible with what we believe.